coming. President Putin knows it. He has blasted Western journalists for not realizing that their governments have a war agenda.
И люди не чувствуют опасности. Вот меня что беспокоит. Ну как мы не можем понять? Мы тащим мир вообще в совершенно новое измерение.
And NATO knows it. It has talked about Russia's aggressive actions and responded by moving its forces closer to Russia's border.
We have decided to enhance our military presence in the eastern part of the alliance. So this is a defensive, proportionate response to the actions of Russia in Ukraine, illegally annexing Crimea.
So why is war coming? What will it be like? And what will come afterwards? These are the questions I want to address in this video. The basic reason why war is coming is that we are experiencing a hegemonic crisis. This is a situation when there is a dominant power, the hegemon, that is stagnant or declining, and another power that is coming up to challenge it. And the challenger wants to rise, and the dominant power, the hegemon, wants to keep it down. And this situation naturally leads to conflict. The classic example of this is the Peloponnesian War of around 400 BC. And the Greek historian Thucydides, who fought in the war, said that while there were many specific causes for it, in his opinion, what made war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta. And today we have the growth of China's power and the fear that this causes in the United States. And the political scientist George Medelsky has drawn up a table of hegemonic cycles going back to the 10th century. And he finds that there's a consistent pattern where the hegemonic crisis results in war, and neither the challenger nor the hegemon goes on to dominate the world in the next cycle, but the true beneficiary is always a third party that becomes the new hegemon. And he finds there's only one example against this, and that involves Britain. Britain took over from the Dutch Republic to be the hegemon during the 18th century, and Britain then faced a challenge from France in the Napoleonic Wars. Britain won those wars and went on to become the hegemon again. And this cycle ended in a new challenge from Germany in the First and Second World Wars. And this time the normal pattern resumed, and the beneficiary was a third party, the United States, which became the new hegemon. And this is the hegemonic cycle we've been in, and that is now coming to its end. Now, people might say, well, hasn't humanity grown up a bit, and can't we do this without actually going to war? Well, not really, because to resolve the hegemonic crisis peacefully, you'd be asking the United States to accept that it will no longer dominate the world. Or you'd be asking China to accept that it must always remain in a subordinate position. And that is asking each side to accept the unacceptable. There are two fundamental questions at issue, which is that the US wants to continue to dominate, but can it? And China wants to break free of American domination, but can it? The only way to resolve this question is to fight it out. And this is an aspect of a more fundamental principle in human affairs that I call the Phoenix Principle. The classic example of this is the adoption of the transistor. The transistor was invented in the United States after the Second World War, but it wasn't taken up there. The American electronics manufacturers were already running successful businesses based on thermionic valves. To take up the transistor, they would have had to redesign all their products. And not only that, but strip out the production lines in their factories and replace them with new production lines to make transistor-based electronics. And they didn't want to do that. They hoped that the transistor was just a passing fad that would soon go away. Whereas the Japanese had just lost the war, they didn't have a functioning electronics industry. Their factories had been destroyed. They had nothing to lose. So they were able to build an electronics industry from scratch, and they could take up this new opportunity of the transistor. And the American electronics manufacturers only eventually adopted the transistor when they were forced to by the success of the Japanese taking away their business. And this applies more generally. In human affairs, there are situations where to go forward you need to go backwards, but people don't want to do that, and it only happens when they are forced to after some kind of destructive episode. And the hegemonic crisis is just one example of such crises in the world today that seem to call for radical rethinking, where the solution will only come after some kind of global cathartic episode that destroys what we're doing today and forces people into new habits of thought and new patterns of behaviour. Now, the first area that suggests this is a general age of crisis is that of global finance. People like George Soros have been saying for a long time that the world's financial system is fundamentally troubled and that it's going to collapse catastrophically. And in 2008 we had the financial crisis, which seemed like the fulfillment of their prophecies. But the Western governments managed to bail out the system and prevent the crisis turning into a total disaster, which was good at the time, but meant that the fundamental problems weren't really resolved. So today there are still serious rumours about the major European banks that they are essentially bankrupt. And it's well known that major economies like Japan, the United Kingdom and the United States have exceptionally high debt levels, which it's difficult to see how they can ever be paid back. Now, the central banks have tried to stimulate the economy by cutting interest rates, and in the past this policy has seemed logical and has worked well, but over the last 6 or 7 years it hasn't really been working. And instead of trying a new approach, the central banks have simply cut interest rates further and further, to the point that they are now negative, which in effect means paying people to borrow money, or alternatively charging them to save their money. But still it's not really working, and it's as though the central banks are in effect pushing on a piece of string. It's a classic case of doing the same thing and expecting a different result, which I think is supposed to be a sign of madness. Now, we should remember that it was in 1944, in the closing stages of the Second World War, that the Conference of Bretton Woods laid down the principles for the world's financial system in the post-war era. So we could expect that another major war, another major global crisis, would similarly lead to the fundamental rethinking that is required and a new approach to world economics and finance. A second aspect of the present age of crisis concerns migration. And this has been in the news recently because large numbers of people have been coming to Europe from Africa and the Middle East as refugees and economic migrants. But this is just the latest development in a world historical process that has been going on since the last hegemonic crisis, i.e. since the Second World War, that has seen the growth of immigrant populations in Europe. Now, throughout history there's been a tendency for people to move from areas of low economic potential to areas of high economic potential. And today we live in a world of international jet travel and a global internet. So it's much easier for people to move around, and information about economic opportunities travels more easily. And at the same time, we've got the pull factor of Europe's great wealth and the push of young and rapidly growing populations in Africa and the Middle East, contrasted with Europe's ageing and stagnant population. So all these factors combine to give the present movement of peoples, the immigration into Europe, an immense inevitability. And it's coming to be realised that this is going to change the whole character of Europe and European society. And there's a question about how much longer it will be a white continent, a Christian continent. And these changes aren't going to occur smoothly and easily. They're going to be difficult and contested, as shown by the rise of identitarian and nationalist movements that have the platform of preserving Europe's traditional character. But these movements aren't going to turn back history. On the other hand, moving forward with history isn't going to be easy either. And all this points to the need for a painful crisis that will sweep away the old assumptions about what Europe is and allow a new conception of Europe to emerge. A third aspect of this age of crisis is innovation failure, our failure to innovate. Now, this might seem strange because we normally think of ourselves as highly innovative with our smartphones and the proliferation of apps and so forth. But it could be argued that we are failing to innovate at the rate we ought to be. And I want to take just one example of this, which is spaceflight. Now, humans landed on the moon in 1969 with what now looks like very primitive technology. But despite all the advances in electronics since then, we've never been back. And the United States has now retired the space shuttle and has no way of getting astronauts into orbit. So things seem to be going backwards. On the other hand, the initiative seems to be passing to private entrepreneurs. For example, Jeff Bezos of Amazon has founded Blue Origin, whose website says, "Earth is just our starting place, and our vision is millions of people living and working in space." And the SpaceX company, founded by Elon Musk of PayPal, says the company was founded to revolutionize space technology with the ultimate goal of enabling people to live on other planets. And Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic says, "Our purpose is to become the space line for the Earth, democratizing access to space for the benefit of life on Earth." And then there is Google's Lunar X Prize, which is sponsoring a competition to land a private probe on the moon, with the first launches taking place next year. And one of the teams competing for that prize says it is not just going to the moon for the sake of winning the prize, but it has the long-term commercial goal of mining the moon for helium-3, which is an ingredient for nuclear fusion. And this is precisely what we should be doing, getting into space and using what space can give us to develop better energy sources and make it cheaper to get into space in the first place. But what have the Western governments been doing? Well, they have been promoting windmills and windmill farms. Now, windmills are not going to get us into space and help us travel through the solar system. And this is all about two contrasting mindsets. The first mindset imagines that humans will always remain on this earth. And so it concludes that we have a problem with overpopulation and global warming and running out of natural resources. And the response is to throttle back on our industrial development and instead move into things like windmills and riding bicycles and the whole green movement. Now, windmills and bicycles are not very good basis for an advanced industrial economy, let alone for travelling to other planets and other star systems. So the result is that humans will end up remaining on this earth. The second mindset starts with the assumption that humans' destiny lies in space. And therefore there are abundant resources available to us, and we need a population explosion in order to spread throughout the universe. And all those ideas that are based on the assumption that there is only one Earth and we must preserve it come to seem irrelevant. Global warming is beside the point when humans are living in space. And so that attitude suggests we should ramp up our technology and industry, develop more powerful energy sources, and make getting into space cheaper. And the result is then that our destiny is in space. And what we need to do is move from one mindset to the other. Now, Arthur Marwick, in War and Social Change in the 20th Century, says that one of the effects of war is, as he puts it, to test the human reluctance to exploit the full potential of science and technology. And I think this is what he's talking about. A future war will have this effect of breaking us away from this mindset that's taken place in Western governments of failing to exploit the potential of space and assume we must stay here on this earth, to the new mindset that's struggling to be born through these private entrepreneurs that humans must get out into space and can do so. So, when will this war break out? Well, for some time I've been thinking in terms of 2020. This is partly based on reading Hamish McRae's book, The World in 2020, where he says that the chance of a nuclear bomb being exploded somewhere on the planet by that date is quite high. It's also a round number, and it assumes that the 21st century will be like the 20th century, with a major war breaking out a couple of decades in. But it's also based on the fact that the crises I have been talking about are coming to a head now. It's not sometime in the future that the world's financial system is going to be in trouble. It's now. And it's not sometime in the future that immigration into Europe is going to be a big political issue. It's now. And it's not sometime in the future that we're going to need a more entrepreneurial approach to space. It's now. And in terms of the hegemonic crisis, it's now that China is bumping up against the United States. In 2014, the IMF said that China overtook the United States as the world's largest economy. And over the last 2 or 3 decades, we've seen what appears to be a growing US policy of containment of China. For example, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, many people said they were about oil. But not because America needs oil, but because China needs oil. By operating in these regions and establishing military bases and friendly regimes there, the United States is gaining control over parts of Asia that provide the markets and mineral resources that China needs for its development. In other words, the US is gaining control over China's development to prevent it from rising too fast. We see a similar thing in Africa, where China has also been active developing markets and drawing on Africa's mineral wealth. In 2007, the United States set up a new Africa Command, AFRICOM, apparently recognizing Africa as an area of great power competition and possible military confrontation. And China is also at the heart of new geopolitical groupings that stand as alternatives to the Western-dominated institutions like the World Bank and IMF, which could be regarded as instruments of American hegemony. The prime example of this is the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, which hold regular summits and have set up the New Development Bank to fund development projects around the world. There's also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes Russia, China and other countries, and including being recently joined by India and Pakistan. And this exists to promote political, economic and military cooperation. And there is China's One Belt, One Road initiative, which exists to create new land and sea routes that will connect China more closely to the rest of the world. And this is linked with the Asia Infrastructural Investment Bank, the AIIB, which funds roads, ports and railways to make these routes a reality. Now, all these programs are helping to shape the world more in China's image, directly challenging the West and the United States, which have become used to shaping the world in their own image. Another thing that suggests these issues are coming to a head now is the changing rhetoric and attitude of the major players. In the 1980s, China's Deng Xiaoping put forward what was called the 24-character strategy, which included the advice, hide your strength and bide your time. But more recently, China has been laying claim to various islands and the surrounding areas in the South China Sea, and when American patrol aircraft have flown over them, sending the message that the US rejects China's claims, the Chinese have responded pretty aggressively, telling the American patrols to leave at once.
Foreign military aircraft, this is Chinese Navy. You are approaching our military alert zone. Leave immediately in order to avoid misjudgment.
And China has said that it will defend its interests in the South China Sea by all necessary means, including military. This seems a long way from Deng Xiaoping's hide your strength and bide your time. And similarly, in the 1990s, Russia looked on without protesting as its former allies in Eastern Europe went over to the western side, joining NATO and the European Union. But more recently, when Ukraine was being drawn into the western camp, Russia didn't hesitate to take back the Crimea, and it's also intervened in Syria to support the regime of President Assad, which is effectively thwarting the United States that has been calling for President Assad to be deposed. And the rhetoric's also changed on the other side, for example with NATO's recent communique severely criticising Russia. And when Malaysian Airlines MH17 was shot down over the Ukraine, the vehemence of the British reaction was quite striking, and this was before any accident investigation, and when to outside observers it was difficult to see what possible motive Russia would have for shooting down a Malaysian plane with many Dutch people on board. So while it's possible Russia did order the shoot down, for example to prevent the Ukrainian Air Force from using civilian airliners as a cover for its activities, it did suggest a deliberate desire to inflame and not calm the situation. On the other hand, I am aware of a tendency in history for situations to persist long beyond the point to which you might think they would break down. For example, the Roman Empire looked close to collapse in the 3rd century AD, but the Emperor Diocletian pulled it back from the brink, and it went on to survive for another couple of centuries. Similarly, the book The Angel of the Revolution, which was published in the early 1890s, talks about a great European war and a Russian Revolution, showing that people were expecting such things even then, though they didn't come along for another couple of decades. So while war between China and the US is looking increasingly inevitable, it might be delayed by perhaps a generation. So we could say that war might break out in 2020, or it could be as late as 2040 or 2050. On the other hand, it might come before 2020 and take us all by surprise, which history also has a habit of doing. Nevertheless, quite a few people have been predicting war in the 2020s. In his study of hegemonic cycles, Medelsky suggests that the next hegemonic war will be in 2026. And in their theory of generations, William Strauss and Neil Howe identify a cycle with a major world crisis occurring every 4th generation. And on the basis of their theory, they predicted that the next world crisis would begin in the early 21st century and culminate in a world war around 2025. And they identify a number of other theorists whose ideas agree with theirs. They include Quincy Wright in his study of war, and Arnold Toynbee in his study of history, and William Thompson in the 1988 book on global war. All of them identify a war cycle and suggest that the next world war will be around 2025 to 2030. And then there is Joshua Goldstein, another student of political and economic cycles, who also suggests that the next global war will be in the decade of the 2020s. Now, for some time, Western militaries have been preparing for World War III as if it would be World War II on steroids, just with better ships, tanks and aircraft. But a new kind of war is emerging with drones, computers and space satellites. And while mindsets are changing, they are changing quite slowly. And I imagine that the opening stages of the coming war will be quite a wake-up call, with the military and society generally on what is known as a steep learning curve. So the first thing to realise about the coming war is that it is likely to go nuclear. Now, people might point out that in World War II, chemical weapons weren't used, even though both sides knew of this technology. And it might be said that similarly in the coming war, people will decide that nuclear weapons are just too horrible to use. But the fact is that the world's militaries have large nuclear arsenals, and the more usual lesson of history is that when people have weapons, they tend to use them. And what is making nuclear weapons more usable is the development of anti-ballistic missile technology, which allows you to shoot down your opponent's nuclear weapons so you can use your own without fear of being nuked in return. And this is what President Putin was complaining about, the American deployment of ABM systems close to Russia's borders. And the United States is also deploying ABM systems in South Korea, close to China. So with nuclear weapons and countermeasures being developed and deployed, the major militaries show every intention of using nuclear weapons, and we must assume that they will do so. But the next thing to realise is that nuclear war won't be the ultimate disaster it is usually painted as. So from post-apocalyptic films and books, we are taught that nuclear war will result in the collapse of civilization, perhaps even the destruction of humanity, or even the entire planet. For example, Einstein said, "I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." But I think these ideas are overblown. The average nuclear weapon will kill everyone within a radius of about 2 miles. Now, if this is on the centre of a major city like London, that is a lot of people, hundreds of thousands. But as nuclear war is getting closer, we can imagine that people are going to start evacuating the cities, and the area covered by such a nuclear weapon, around 13 square miles, is small compared to the area of Great Britain, which is around 94,000 square miles. And Britain is quite a small country. There's also Europe and the United States and Canada. So to kill everyone, or even a sizable proportion of the population, is going to be impossible. Now, I know that people aren't just worried about being killed in the initial blast. There's also the fear of nuclear fallout, radioactivity. But the effect of this is to raise your chances of getting cancer. And there are many things that can raise your chance of getting cancer. But this doesn't mean that you will get cancer, or that if you get it, you can't be cured. So it's not a death sentence. And we should remember that the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which were nuked in 1945, are today perfectly habitable and thriving parts of Japan. So the idea that nuclear war will make large areas off limits for thousands of years is not really supported by the evidence. But if we suppose a worst case scenario let's say nuclear war kills 1 billion people. Well, that's only 1/10 of the world's population, which I think is still ludicrously high. But we should remember that in World War II, in Belarus, 1 in 4 of the population was killed. And in the Middle Ages Black Death, 1 in 3 people were killed. But this didn't lead to the collapse of civilization or the end of history. Humans and human society are incredibly resilient. Now, I'm not trying to trivialize nuclear war. It will be absolutely horrible. But what I do question is this idea that it will be some kind of final event. On the contrary, incredibly resilient humans and human society will come through the war and bounce back, and civilization and progress will continue afterwards, even if we let off every nuclear weapon we now have, and indeed others that may be built and deployed during the war itself. In any case, nuclear war is not likely to be the way it was imagined in the Cold War. Then we had the concept of mutually assured destruction, and the idea was that the enemy would suddenly, out of the blue, press their red button and send their entire nuclear arsenal heading over to you. And you would detect this on your early warning radars and press your own red button and send your entire nuclear arsenal heading back towards them. So there would be this immense crossover, and every nuclear weapon on the planet would be going off all at once. But I don't think this is likely to happen in a future war, because remember, it has to be out of the blue to achieve that element of surprise to be effective. And the side that is first to do this will lose all legitimacy in world opinion. And I don't think that the United States or Russia or China is likely to want to invite the condemnation of the international community by taking such a drastic and unexpected step. Instead, nuclear weapons are likely to be used in specific scenarios. For example, during World War II, part of the campaign was an attempt to destroy the enemy's infrastructure and industry, and this involved waves of bombers night after night, and in the process large numbers of aircrew were killed. Well, nuclear weapons will seem like a quick and less risky way of achieving the same effect. So nuclear weapons may be used to destroy the enemy's aircraft factories and oil refineries in the hope of destroying their war effort and forcing them to an early surrender. And another way nuclear weapons might be used is if a country is being subject to a naval blockade that is preventing important supplies getting through. Again, nuclear weapons will seem like a quick way to end the blockade, and better than using conventional ships and aircraft, which will no doubt be subject to heavy losses and take much longer to achieve the same effect. So nuclear war is not likely to involve nuclear warheads raining down all over the planet in a mass orgy of destruction. Instead, they will be used for specific military and strategic objectives in a considered way and over a lengthy period of time. Now, nuclear war could be considered old hat insofar as nuclear weapons have already been used in war. But what is new is cyber war. And this is already underway, as China has been accused of planting spyware, so-called advanced persistent threats, in the computer systems of British and American banks and government departments. And Russia has been accused of launching cyber attacks on Georgia and Estonia when it was involved in conflicts and disputes with those countries. So cyber espionage will be a part of the coming war. And also denial of service attacks, for example, to prevent military headquarters from communicating with their troops, and to disrupt enemy financial systems, preventing them from paying their troops and buying equipment. And the potential of cyber war is also shown by the Stuxnet virus. This is believed to have been an American-Israeli cyber weapon, which infiltrated the Iranian nuclear program. And the effect of Stuxnet was to damage the Iranian nuclear equipment, preventing it from enriching the uranium that could have been used in a nuclear bomb. And a particularly worrying scenario is that presented in the 2015 novel Ghost Fleet, which is based on the idea that the Chinese have planted back doors in the computer chips that they have supplied to the United States over the years. So when war breaks out, the Chinese use the back doors to disable the computer chips, rendering the American military hardware completely useless. Another novel aspect of the coming war will be the war in space. During the First Gulf War of 1991, Western war correspondents were amazed by the American cruise missiles, which could pinpoint not only particular buildings, but particular floors, particular offices within those buildings, and they would take right-angled turns down the streets on the way to the target. And they could do this because of satellite navigation, GPS, the Global Positioning System. So, for example, China, which knows that it will be subject to a barrage of such cruise missiles as soon as war breaks out, would be well advised to have a capability of shooting down the American GPS satellites that give them the ability to find their targets. And indeed, China has conducted anti-satellite tests. It killed a test satellite in 2007, and it is believed to have conducted similar tests more recently. And so, of course, has the United States. Satellites aren't just important for navigation, they're also used for communications and for reconnaissance. So we can expect that attacks on each other's satellites will be an important part of the coming war. And it should be noted that while the Americans have developed the GPS system, the Russians have recently completed their own system, GLONASS, and Russian military and civilian vehicles are required to operate with both GPS and GLONASS. But in the United States this is not the case. And this means that in a war, the Russians can defeat the American satellite navigation capability while preserving their own. But the Americans will need to destroy their own system, as well as that of the Russians, if they want to defeat the Russian capability. A more familiar aspect to the coming war may be the war at sea. The world's oceans are still very important for trade, for the movement of military forces, and for general control of the planet. Now, a large part of China's trade passes through the Malacca Strait between Indonesia and Malaysia. It imports oil this way from the Middle East, and China's cargo ships pass through the Malacca Strait on their way to markets in Asia, Africa and Europe. So blocking the Malacca Strait would be an obvious military objective in a war with China. And indeed, the United States Navy conducts regular exercises with the Australians that could be regarded as rehearsing the scenario of taking control of the Malacca Strait. And more generally, China has limited access to the world's oceans. If we look at the map, we see it is surrounded by a screen of islands from Japan through Taiwan, the Philippines to Indonesia. And this is why Taiwan is particularly important to China. For historical reasons of the 20th century, Taiwan is de facto independent of China, but China has insisted that Taiwan should not become permanently independent. It has the long-term objective of taking back control of Taiwan. And it has threatened that if Taiwan moves towards formal independence, it will result in a military invasion. And this is because Taiwan is China's window on the Pacific. If Taiwan becomes formally independent, China's access to the world's oceans will be completely controlled by foreign powers. And Russia has similar problems of access to the oceans. It has ports at Vladivostok, at Archangel and at St. Petersburg, but all of these are frozen during the winter months. The sea turns to ice. The fleet at St. Petersburg also has to go through the Baltic and past the Danish archipelago in order to get into the Atlantic Ocean, and most of this route is in the hands of NATO. Russia's only warm water port is at Sevastopol in the Crimea in the Black Sea, and the Russian Navy here has to pass through the Bosphorus in order to get into the Mediterranean, and the Bosphorus is entirely in Turkish territory, and Turkey is a NATO member. And even then the Navy's only got through to the Mediterranean. It still has to pass along the Mediterranean and through the Pillars of Hercules to reach the ocean. And again, most of this route is running the gauntlet of NATO countries. And we have recently seen a coup attempt against President Erdogan of Turkey. And President Erdogan has responded by both blaming this on the United States and making efforts to improve Turkey's relationship with Russia. It even looks as though the Russians may have warned Erdogan about the coup. And a shift of Turkey away from NATO and towards Russia is, of course, very good news for Russia. And this shows the sort of geopolitical manoeuvring that is taking place as we move towards global war. And the difficulties of China and Russia in reaching the oceans can be contrasted with the situation of the United States, which has completely unfettered access to the world's two major oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic. And this is true of many NATO countries, which also have good access to the oceans. So this represents a huge disadvantage for Russia and or China in any war with NATO. And this is even worse for China than it is for Russia, because China is very dependent on the rest of the world for mineral resources and for markets, whereas Russia is largely self-sufficient. It has a huge territory and it has abundant mineral resources. So in the event of a war with the United States, Russia will be a very desirable ally for China, with whom it shares a land border. Another big issue in the coming war, I think, will be control of the equator. We've already seen that space is going to be important, with people trying to destroy each other's satellites. And more generally, with us breaking through our recent failure to exploit the potential of space and moving into space more aggressively. Now, if you are going into space, it makes sense to launch from as close to the equator as possible. This is because the planet's surface is moving fastest at the equator, and so you get the biggest boost to help you into orbit. And that means using less fuel to get into orbit and having more fuel once you're up there to manoeuvre. So those people in the coming war who control the equator may have that little advantage that gives them the edge they need to win the war. So I think we're going to see a struggle for these equatorial regions of Brazil, Central Africa, Indonesia, and to some extent southern India and North Australia. And if we look back through history, we see that the world's first civilizations arose along river valleys in the Nile, the Tigris-Euphrates, the Indus, and the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. And we can relate this to the fact that with the technology of the day, transport and communications were easiest along rivers. But then as maritime technology improved and people became able to cross the seas, and particularly the Mediterranean Sea, it's perhaps no coincidence that the focus of civilization moved to Greece and Italy, two peninsulas jutting out into the sea and best placed to take advantage of the transport and communications possibilities that it offered. And then as maritime technology improved further and people moved out into the oceans, it's perhaps no coincidence that the focus of civilization moved to the Atlantic seaboard and the United States with its easy access to the oceans, and therefore to the regions that were best placed to take advantage of the new transport and communications possibilities that ocean travel presented. So as humanity moves off the planet Earth and into space, then it's going to be the equatorial region that offers the easiest access to space that is likely to become the new focus for power and prosperity. And so again, I repeat that I think control of this equatorial belt will be an important strategic objective of the two sides in the coming war. Let me now talk about how events will unfold. First, China or Russia will declare war on the United States/NATO. The war will go on for a long time, longer than people expect. The aggressor, China or Russia, will be defeated. And in the period after the war, it will become clear that the present hegemon, the United States, has come down in the world, and a third-party country or region will emerge as the beneficiary and the new leader of the world. Let me unpack each of those points. First, previous hegemonic cycles suggest that it is the challenger that initiates the war. But although China or Russia will be the ones to declare war, either formally or by doing something that is clearly an act of war, this will only come after they have been provoked by some insult or attempted constraint on their behaviour, so that from their perspective they will have been pushed into war, and it will be NATO or the US that is the real aggressor. And in a sense this will be true. You see, the perennial problem for the challenger in a hegemonic crisis is that of going too soon, starting the war before it is strong enough to win it. And the leaders of China and Russia know this, and so they have tried to show patience, as illustrated by Deng Xiaoping's advice of bide your time. They don't really want war, they just want to continue their peaceful development. But to the hegemon, the United States in this case, peaceful development that challenges its geopolitical dominance is ipso facto an aggressive act. So it's the hegemon that wants the war to have the opportunity to crush the challenger and knock it back into subordination. So what kind of provocation might lead China or Russia to forget themselves and kick off the war that they know they really ought to avoid? In the case of China, very likely American disrespect of its claims in the South China Sea, which might lead it eventually to open fire on an American patrol aircraft or ship. Another possible trigger is if Taiwan crosses one of the red lines set by China, such as declaring full independence or acquiring nuclear weapons. In this case, China will attack Taiwan and find itself at war with the United States. In the case of Russia, a likely scenario is it sending troops into one of the Baltic states or the Ukraine, as it would see it, to protect Russian-speaking populations there from mistreatment by their governments. But this will immediately put it in a state of war with NATO, which guarantees the territorial integrity of those countries. A more long-term possibility concerns disputes over exploitation of the Arctic, especially if global warming opens up that region to development. And again, American disrespect of Russia's claims in that region may lead to a physical clash. It will not necessarily be both China and Russia that start the war with the United States. It will most likely be one or the other, and most probably China. But if China does go to war with the United States, Russia may well join in on its side. But even if it tries to remain neutral and just maintain normal relationships with China, this will be considered by the United States as aggressive and making Russia a legitimate enemy. And this may be why NATO is currently so aggressive in its language towards Russia, while barely mentioning China. It's a case of softening up China's potential allies. You deal first with the supporting actors in order to isolate the main threat and make yourself free to concentrate your full effort on that main threat in due course. Now, I said that the war would go on for longer than expected. When the shooting first starts, we'll probably hear people saying it will all be over in weeks or even days, but it will actually go on for years. And this is because it is a hegemonic war whose purpose is to decide who really has the power to dominate this world. So it will be a fight to the death, or at least to a decisive outcome. People will throw everything they've got at it. There won't be any half measures. It will be a war of national survival in which each side draws on the entire resources of its respective country or alliance. And people won't give up unless they absolutely have been defeated and have no real choice. And why this will take time is because things won't go smoothly. It will be a real struggle. So in an ideal world, each side will think it can destroy the enemy's satellites, nuke their capital cities, take down their national communications infrastructure with cyber attacks, and it will all be over. But in reality, things won't go according to plan. The enemy will turn out to be able to defeat some of these attacks and at the same time to degrade your own systems so that you won't be able to operate as you would like. And this will lead to a process of learning and innovation in an escalating manner as each side tries to get round the enemy's tactics and defences. We've seen this in Iraq and Afghanistan, and how much more so will it be true in a war against China or Russia? So yes, this hegemonic war will settle down to be a long, hard struggle that goes on for years, if not decades. In the end, however, China and or Russia will be defeated. And the basic reason for this is that it will have gone too soon. And this in turn will be because it will have underestimated the strength of the United States. You see, today the United States can look like a troubled country. It has massive debt, it has internal ethnic tensions, there have been well-publicised problems with some of its major military procurement programmes. All these things can make it look like a weak foe. But this is how it is in a time of relative peace, when there is no real threat to the homeland. When war is declared on it, when it is fighting for its survival, it will be a different story. The United States will show that it has hidden reserves of strength. The very act of declaring war on it will cause it to pull together and show that it is still an incredibly resourceful country that is capable of pulling off feats on a grand scale, and, what is vital, that still has many important friends around the world. Its adversary, on the other hand, will find that it is fighting pretty much alone, with few worthwhile allies and at a massive geographical disadvantage. The hegemon, with the power and wealth, is always more popular than the challenger. But although Russia or China will lose, they will find that this is not the ultimate disaster it at first seems to be. The Phoenix principle will apply. Consider what might be called the winner's curse that affected the British Empire at the end of World War II, when it found itself with much obsolete baggage, whereas the losers, Japan and Germany, were able to start with a blank sheet and go on to become economic giants. And in his book Winners and Other Losers in War and Peace, Arnold says that winning is just another form of losing. And the corollary of this is that losing is another form of winning. And so as losers, China or Russia may get rid of, for example, political systems or other things that are currently holding them back. and so they may go on to great things in the next era. What is unlikely, or even impossible insofar as they are the defeated parties, is that China or Russia will become the new hegemon. On the other hand, the United States may find it difficult to reassert its hegemony. It will have exhausted itself in this bitter fight to the death, and its existing problems such as debt and ethnic tensions will re-emerge. And it will also find that the war has empowered others. For example, the scramble for Africa's mineral wealth will have helped that continent to develop its resources. And the building of spaceports to help the war in space will have brought new importance and prosperity to this equatorial belt. So this is why a third party is likely to emerge as the beneficiary of the war and take over leadership of the world. So who will be this third party beneficiary? Well, despite what I've just said, it could be the United States if it studies theoretical history well enough and understands what that will take. But this could be the United States in a different form. For example, it may no longer be dominated by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and parts of the United States may break away, or it may acquire new regions, Canada or Mexico. It may even establish a true worldwide empire, a proper empire, where it brings real peace to the countries it dominates and ends up governing them and developing their economies and raising taxes there. So all this is possible, though I don't think it is particularly likely. As for China or Russia, one of these countries might emerge as hegemon if it manages to stay out of the war. This is more feasible for Russia than it is for China, though again, I don't think it is particularly likely. I think they will be drawn into the war despite their best efforts not to get involved. Other possibilities are Brazil or India. These are members of the BRICS. They are big countries with big populations and valuable resources. Brazil with its natural resources and India with its human resources. They're also astride this equatorial region. Perhaps even South Africa or Iran or even Australia. What we can be sure of is that Europe will come out of this war with sharply reduced relevance in world affairs. The countries of Europe went into World War II as colonial powers, and they came out stripped of their empires. This time they will go into the war as comparatively small countries living on past glories, and they will come out as also-rans of minor importance in the victory and so of minor importance in the post-war world. And what I think will be the ultimate long-term beneficiary of the war is the continent of Africa. Again, the Phoenix principle. This continent starts from a very low base, so it is ideally situated to take advantage of the amazing opportunities of a space-going civilization that will emerge from the war. And this continent also has abundant resources, and it will be a strategic objective of the war, so it will receive massive investment. And it's astride this highly strategic equatorial region that I think is going to be as important in future history as the river valleys, the seas, and the oceans in their turn once were. I would like to finish with what might be advice for the main parties. So for Russia, the advice might be, stay out of this war. Don't help China, even though it might seem dishonourable to abandon your recent friend. Offer your help to the United States even, if it would be accepted. For China, the advice might be, bide your time. Resist reacting to the possibly outrageous provocations that will come your way. Swallow your pride. Find ways round. Concentrate on your economic development and avoid at all costs getting drawn into war. For the United States, the advice might be, don't delay. Every month that the war is postponed, your adversary grows in strength. And for the United Kingdom, the advice might be there's an important decision to be made. Is it better to be on the side that wins the war or the side that wins the peace?